Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AF New England's Speaker Series webinar, Beyond Tuskegee, the impact of institutional trustworthiness and everyday racism on racial diversity in research in allergies and asthma. My name is Jan Hansen, and I'm president of the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, New England chapter. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, AF New England is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is to improve the quality of life for all those who are living with or affected by those who are or caring for someone with the health conditions of asthma, allergies, including food allergies, and related diseases. We serve all 6 New England states, and we've been doing this since 1979. We fulfill our mission through a wide range of activities, including our educational programming, such as our Speaker Series webinars, through our awareness initiatives, such as our asthma and allergy bulletins that we publish 3 times annually, through our support services for our community, through our legislative advocacy for improved public policies, both local, state, and federal, and through our support for research, including our $10,000 Medical Fellows Research Grant, which we launched last year. And we continue to raise awareness about inequities and access to healthcare and ways in which to affect positive change. We do this through our programming and our advocacy work. And our program this afternoon is a perfect example of our commitment to this goal. AF New England would like to take a moment to thank Metro Credit Union as our Speaker Series sponsor for this webinar this afternoon. We are greatly appreciative of their support of our educational programming and this initiative. Tonight's webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded as I speak by AF New England and will be available for future viewing on our website, asthmaandallergies.org. So if any of you know someone who wanted to tune in and this wasn't working for timing for them, we will be sending out an email to let you know when it's up on our website for future viewing. We are going to ask that all program attendees remain on mute for the duration of the program so that everyone will have the best possible audio experience. And if you do have a question during the program, you can type it into the chat box at any time, and we're going to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. But before we begin, I'd like to share that any mention or reference of a company, organization, or institution, or their products or services shouldn't be construed as an endorsement or recommendation by AFA New England. Information presented in this program should not be used as a substitute for professional medical care to diagnose or treat any symptoms or illnesses. And AFA New England will not be responsible for any actions taken by any attendees or viewers as a result of this program. And now, this afternoon, I am very pleased to introduce you to our very distinguished panel of speakers for this very important webinar. Dr. Margie Louisius is a board-certified internist, pediatric, and adult allergist immunologist, and a health services researcher in community-based interventions to reduce racial disparities in pediatric asthma. She's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, an associate physician and director of equity and inclusion in the Division of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, and an assistant program director for racial justice and equity of the Internal Medicine Residency Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Louisius is recognized locally and nationally through honors and awards granted from her specialty organization and home institution, and for publications on asthma, structural racism, and physician advocacy. And Dr. Louisius is a member of AF New England's Board of Directors. Dr. Lakia Wright is a board-certified internist, allergist, and immunologist. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship training in allergy and immunology at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Boston. She's a graduate of Harvard School of Public Health with a Master of Public Health degree in healthcare management and policy. She's an associate physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and she has an interest in asthma disparities. For Dr. Wright's disclosures, she's a clinical research director at Sanofi, and she previously worked as a medical director at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Dr. Wright's views expressed during this presentation are her own personal views, and her views do not represent the views of her employers. Dr. Jessica Sturm is an associate professor of medicine and pediatrics in the divisions of allergy, immunology, and rheumatology, and pediatric allergy and immunology at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry in Rochester, New York. Her research interests include the use of implementation science to improve health equity in allergic and immunologic disease. She's a UCSF Research in Implementation Science for Equity Scholar. And along with her research, she is passionate about diversifying the medical and research scientific workforce. She created the Allergy and Immunology IM and medical student clerkships. She is a DEI champion for the Allergy, Immunology, and Rheumatology Division and the Associate Program Director of DEI for the U Rochester Internal Medicine Residency. We welcome all of our spectacular speakers and thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us this afternoon. I think you'll all agree with me that we are very fortunate to have such an exceptional panel of speakers. For this program, Dr. Louisius will serve as both a panelist and a moderator, and this formatting will be more like a fire chat discussion with a great flow for exchange of ideas. This afternoon, this discussion will look at the historical context of medical mistreatment of minoritized populations and how this has led to medical mistrust, the impact of lack of diversity in clinical trials, and how medical institutions and industry can demonstrate trustworthiness and practical solutions to increase diversity in clinical trials. And with that, I am very pleased to turn this program over to Dr. Margie Louisius. Dr. Louisius?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan, for that wonderful introduction. It's always weird hearing your bios and the bios of my friends.
I am sure.
Right?
I am sure.
Yeah, no, but again, I agree with such a distinguished group of people and glad to call you guys my friends as well. So, and it's great to see some familiar names in the audience. And so definitely look forward to of receiving questions or just comments and to really, have the latter part of this panel, at least at last, 15 minutes or so, or even longer, depending on how things go, to have a conversation. And so I just wanted to kick off our conversation for us to discuss some different ways in which patients can participate in research. And Jessica, maybe can you discuss some of the goals of clinical research?
Sure. Thanks. So there are multiple goals of clinical research that we know of. And some of the goals that most people know about are developing new treatments or medications. Sometimes we need to identify causes of illness or study trends in epidemiology, the prevalence or incidence of new diseases, and also evaluating the ways in which genetics or epigenetics are related to an illness. And there's different types of study designs to accomplish all of these goals. Some trials require that people give consent and take medications as part of the research, or give some sort of blood tissue specimen or other types of biopsies that let researchers use the specimens. Sometimes they've already been collected. And some other studies use data that's been de-identified. In allergy and immunology, we often conduct studies to inform and support the evidence-based clinical decisions that we make all the time in the management of things of food allergy, asthma, and other immunologic-related diseases.
No, thank you for that. And Kia, maybe can you tell us about the different types of clinical research? I mean, I think Jessica hit on it, but maybe just give some labels so people are more aware of how they participate.
So, we could think about it as like two large groups: an observational study, and this is where researchers collect information from participants, or they might look at data that was already collected, and researchers follow the group of people over a period of time. And then the other big group that we think about is a group of studies is clinical trials. So this research is really looking at an intervention, whether it's medical, surgical, or behavioral, and it's really trying to evaluate whether the intervention is effective and safe, and usually it's being compared to the standard of care, or not receiving the intervention. And so those are the two sort of big buckets that we can think about.
Right. Because again, as we, know, all of us know, but really also for the audience, is that there's so many different types. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to try to really focus more on clinical trials. Since we're in that setting, you're like Kia mentioned, we're, testing, a type of intervention, and there's a really huge role for patient participation in this setting. So, and I wanted us to maybe talk about more about the phases of clinical trials, because I feel like, for patients, it could be really, or even just, people in general who are interested in research, it could be confusing hearing like the different phases and how like people can be involved in each way. So maybe, starting back up with Jessica again, maybe could you, talk about those phases and how people can participate?
The first thing I'll say is that there's different reasons for people participating in the trials, and that goes into the different phases. But first, some people participate in clinical trials because none of the standard approved treatments are working, or they can't tolerate them because of certain side effects. Other times there's a time in which the standard medication has not helped or failed. And other people want to just participate because they want to help the advancement of our medical knowledge. And so if we talk about the specific phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and translational trials, I think that Dr. Wright can talk about those specific clinical trials and whether there's placebos or not. Those are sorts of things that people have heard of before.
Yes, so it can be confusing, and so you want to think about it, as Dr. Stern mentioned, 4 major phases, and that phase 1, you want to think about it as like a small group of participants that you're evaluating, safety primarily, looking at side effects, and
Right.
then if that's okay, meaning that it's a favorable profile, you don't see any like a huge warning signals or anything like that, then it's you can move into that second phase, which you typically has like a larger group compared to the phase 1, and then you're really looking at is this drug or treatment effective,
So does it
and
work?
does it work?
Right.
Does it work? And you're still looking at safety, but you're adding in that layer of does it work, right?
Right.
Because it's the buildup is so that like you want to do a small group and then slightly larger and then slightly
Right.
larger, because of course at the very core is always safety and
Right.
it's always effectiveness. So but you want to go in order to make sure that you are gathering information in pieces in order to move on, appropriately move on to the next phase. So the phase 3 is sometimes what you classically sort of think about. It's really large clinical trial. You have some of that preliminary data with the phase 1 and phase 2, and you're still looking at effectiveness and side effects. But you're usually comparing it to like a standard treatment or placebo, meaning like you're not getting active drug versus active drug, or if there's already a standard of care, you can compare that standard of care to this investigational medication.
Right.
And so then, so that is used to get drugs approved and products and treatments approved. And then phase 4, it's like after the approval comes, in that phase 3, they might answer some pivotal questions, but then there may be like subgroup studies or additional questions that need to be answered. And then that's a phase 4, like after the drug has been approved, but they're seeking more information. And that's sort of like a general overview. And it's all to make sure that we're ensuring safety and efficacy at each stage, but then like building on our knowledge of the treatment.
Right. And I think another thing we have to also discuss is that how all clinical trials have guidelines or what we call like an eligibility criteria about who can participate and not. And again, we could talk about this a little bit later about how that can impact diversity as well, in terms of sometimes that criteria could be a little bit too strict, right? But again, a lot of times we're looking at the age, so for example, some initially when you're doing trials, you may limit, limit it to only adults, for example, you test an adult and then you'll actually, then do a pediatric trial, for example, or in the setting of like oncology, we have different trials focusing on different stages of that disease. or that person's comorbidities or like other medical conditions that they have. But again, the idea is that we want to try to, and I guess this is a tough part when you're doing research, is that you want to make sure that the people that would be affected by that condition are in the trial, but at the same time, if they're too sick, for example, it may be difficult for you to, include that person, because again, when you were mentioning that safety piece, if that person's other medical condition that they have is making them sick, it's going to be hard for you to assess, like if that new intervention is causing that, some side effects, or is that person's like other medical condition causing that. So again, that makes a lot of sense. And so Kia, maybe can you tell us a little bit more about, so you already mentioned the different types of phases. So I can imagine again that it's going to affect the places in which you can take clinical trials. So maybe could you tell us a little bit more about that, and then also who provides funding?
Yes. So with clinical trials, we typically think of them as occurring in large academic centers, like these large hospitals that are affiliated with medical schools and things like that. But then there can also be like freestanding monitoring sites. And one thing about the pandemic, it sort of like pushed the needle as far as like centralizing clinical trials, which basically means like how can we look for ways to make the clinical trial more accessible to more people. For example, having satellite clinics within the community. And one of the things that we'll get into a little bit more is that, these are like multiple visits associated with the clinical trial. If you want to have underrepresented minorities, it's best to target to incorporate large academic centers that are actually within areas that have large populations of underserved, underrepresented minorities. So if that's not the case, and at least having satellite sites, because we know that there are some existing partnerships between large academic centers and perhaps smaller community centers.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so because some of the visits, do have to be in person. However, the pandemic really, really forced people to think about, does every visit have to be in person?
Right.
And think about the frequency of the visit. And you have seen that like this progression where there's more incorporation of virtual visits. And then even for patients that technology may be challenging, perhaps like older patient population where it may be hard to log onto a platform, even having telephone visits, how can we incorporate that? And so, we think of it as large academic centers, but it's really being, decentralized in an effort to open up access. And then regarding funding, there could be multiple sources of funding, like the sponsors of a medical product or drug, government agencies with the National Institute of Health, and then nonprofits or foundations. And sometimes you'll see partnerships because people really want to come together within these different industries to help, bring a trial along, help it come to fruition and make sure it is completed and carry it through the cycle. So I think it can be a variety of funding mechanisms.
Absolutely.
And then I would like to transition to ask some questions myself to Dr. Stern and Dr. Luisias. What types of clinical research have you participated in, and what do you tell patients who are interested in clinical studies or trials when they have allergic or immunologic diseases? And so I'll start first by handing it over to Dr. Luisias to answer.
Thank you. So for myself, I've been involved in a number of clinical trials, but the one I could we talk most about is about asthma, that I've been involved with the most. But in those settings, typically you're looking to see if the drugs are effective for asthma symptoms or control or potentially prevent asthma. And one most recent study that was already published, we were looking at, it was a trial that was actually looking at the role of school-wide integrated pest management. So this is basically, a form of extermination to reduce the amount of mouse allergen that can be done typically, in the home or other, regular institutions. But the idea was to do this in a school setting in a more intense way, and along with some education. And then we also had the intervention also include classroom-based HEPA filtration to look at asthma outcomes in school children with asthma. So this is an example of a situation where we're not looking at a drug, but we're looking at an intervention that is like not directly, affecting a patient's, affecting subjects, for example, but looking at really the impact of that intervention on the subject's environment. Another, clinical research that some of us may be involved with, and again, for those of us who are most familiar with food allergy in the audience, a lot of times we're looking at ways to protect people from accidental exposures to different allergens, so that they don't, end up having a severe reaction. And so, for example, there's been some studies that look at the role of embedding like a patch or like something like a Band-Aid to deliver peanut protein. And the goal of this, of this study is to look at the role of giving that small amounts of peanut protein through the skin to do something called desensitize or make the immune system tolerant to peanut protein, and to help children and others be at reduced risk of getting a severe allergic reaction if they had an accidental exposure.
And I've been involved in that type of study, but also other school-based asthma studies. I'm mostly looking at different forms of delivering medications, mostly in schools, and involving community members in helping improve outcomes for historically marginalized populations. So this is work that's been done in many cities across the country, many areas across the country, and it's shown in many settings that involving sort of the community really helps in outcomes for kids, specifically school nursing. So getting school nurses involved in delivering medications at school, monitoring kids, and doing some education with kids in schools really help outcomes. And what's nice about that is that it's not necessarily a new medication being used, but different methods of care. And so we know that those kids who are involved in getting their medications at school, getting good education about it, can have better outcomes. And that type of model has thus been sort of disseminated across the country in various environments. And so it's more of how do we improve uptake of different types of treatments, which can be really effective.
Thank you, Dr. Stern and Dr. Lucius. And I have a question about racial demographics of clinical research participants. Can we talk about, like the typical racial demographics and statistics around that?
Yeah, so thanks. So as we know, this is so important, and we know that research in general is defined as doing a systemic investigation, including research development, testing, evaluation, and treatment, and develop things that will contribute to generalizable knowledge. But we have to remember that for that specific, for those research findings that we find from a specific sample of participants to be generalizable for other people and the population of interest, let's say the US population, we need to know that that sample that we're studying is representative of the broader population. And we know that when research is not diverse, the inferences and what we decide is right from the conclusions can be subjected to bias. And it can lead us to make inappropriate conclusions about things. And so we know that our sort of society, our US population, is heterogeneous in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, culture, geography, and behaviors. And to really, we're talking about sort of allergy and immunology here, to evaluate treatment and understand our mechanisms, we need to make sure that our samples really represent the full diversity of our population. So one example is that in 2020, the US FDA granted approval of 53 new drugs, whose clinical trials enrolled about 32,000 patients. And among these clinical trial participants, 3/4 of them were white, 11% were Hispanic or Latino, and only 8% were Black. And so this is substantially less racially and ethnically diverse than our general population, which is estimated to be about 60% white, 19% Hispanic or Latino, and then 13% Black. And so that's low participation among racial and ethnic minoritized groups. Another really interesting thing about allergy and immunology, and one specific example that we give, is that as Dr. Luisia said, there are different methods to study food allergy and prevention of food allergy. And recently there was a phase 3 trial of a medication called Palforzia that's approved by the FDA. It's a food oral immunotherapy. And out of 551 participants, only 5 participants were Black. And they didn't report in their publication those who had Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. And that's when we compare the prevalence of food allergy, about half of all food allergy patients are either Black, Hispanic or Latino, or multiracial. And so we can see that there's a big disparity in who's actually being studied in our clinical research. And so that gives us pause about what can we say about the findings that we get. So it's really important in that. And so I think that Dr. Luisius is going to talk about why we need more reflective samples.
Dr. Louisa, you are on mute.
Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had muted my sorry. No, I was saying, I just realized that Dr. Wright, when you were addressing me, you were using my last name and I was calling you by your first name. I'm like,
Absolutely.
I was like, wait, should I be calling her Dr. Wright? No, but yeah, no, I think in terms of the importance of diversity. So I think one of the things that I always try to convey, in every setting that I can, is that the reason why we even want diversity to begin with is that we really want to be able to have, the people that are participating in our research to be reflective of the whole universe of people with that particular condition. And again, if the people that are participating in that research are a homogeneous population, whatever data that you end up extracting from those people and whatever results you get, it's hard for you to really feel truly confident that you can generalize that to people. And I think for those of us, particularly who are clinicians, or even for patients themselves, you're just like, when something comes out, you're like, why did they even think of that? Like, how did they even think of like putting that type of intervention together, or that drug, like, or even the delivery of that drug in that way? Because they clearly didn't take into account, the voice of the patient in that particular case. But in terms of just what we do know about demographics, we do actually know that even though that the data, like Dr. Stern had mentioned, in terms of the demographics of these trials tend to have less Black and Brown patients in them, we do know that phase 1 trials tend to have more minoritized patients in them. So that makes you think again, like what is happening, really in these latter phases of the trials that people are not participating. And we have to take, again, a step back as researchers and as institutions and things of like, why is there interest or why is there participation in these earlier phases, and it drops off in the end? And it really, I think, also debunks the myth that people don't, Black and Latinx patients or even Indigenous patients don't want to, participate, because we clearly see in phase 1, they're there. And I think the other thing I wanted to convey, I know, Jessica, Dr. Stern, brought up, some specific examples, but there was one actual paper in 2021 that, similarly looked at some oral immunotherapy trials over a several-year period, and saw that across 5 seminal, oral immunotherapy trials, there was literally only 6 Black patients, and there were 0 Latinx patients in that one. And I think, for me, it was one of those things where even when I was reading this particular paper, thinking about, again, this lack of racial diversity that we're seeing in these trials, prevents the the researchers or even the people who are developing these different interventions of thinking through, how can we even have the study done in a way that's feasible, for example, because you think about, the way in which oral immunotherapy is actually given in the clinical setting. It requires multiple visits. It requires several hours of time being there. And so again, if, a diverse population was actually included in the co-design of the study, perhaps we would have been able to have a less burdensome, process that was included in the way OIT is delivered. So I think, again, we're seeing, this lack of, diversity really impacting the uptake of these different, treatments for our patients as well.
Thank you, Dr. Luisius. And I have a question which we're sort of touching upon. Typically, researchers will bring up historical examples of, why there is a lack of representation among underrepresented minorities and why there may be some hesitation. We know that Tuskegee is sometimes cited, and can you discuss different reasons why there may be a lack of racial diversity? Go a little bit do a deeper dive in that area, and can you explain as well as Dr. Stern and Dr. Luisius, can you explain contributing factors, Tuskegee and beyond, that's contributing to this lack of participation?
Sure. I can start with that. So colloquially known as Tuskegee, and another name to call it, and it's being reframed a little bit as the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee. And the reason why that reframing is being made is because, it was studied by the Public Health Service in the U.S. And so the reason what happened with that study is what the researchers were doing were studying untreated syphilis. And what's really egregious about it is that there was a treatment that became available in 1945, which is penicillin, our oldest antibiotic. And that would have helped the 339 participants with the disease. And one of the things that's most important is that what was being done was not explained. The study risks were not explained to the participants, and no formal agreements or consent, as we call it now, was made. And it wasn't until news of the study leaked out in 1972 did the unethical and discriminatory behavior become sort of into the light. And had we known, those actions could have prevented a lot of illness and death, not only for the participants, but for their families, as we know, because it's a sexually transmitted disease. And so that led to a lot of morbidity and mortality. And the failings within that study did lead to the creation of lots of changes in clinical research, including the Bell-Run report, which does address ethical issues whenever research participants are asked to participate in studies. And so today, because of that type of study, institutional review boards have to review all of the studies and guidelines and protocols that are in place. Now, that's a study that's cited a lot, but there are other studies that have done similar things. One of the other ones that people have heard about is the study of Henrietta Lacks, who was a 30-year-old woman who had cervical cancer, and she was seen at Johns Hopkins, and she went for treatment and had an evaluation, and on biopsy of her cervix, some cells were taken, and she didn't know that was taken without her consent. She went for treatment. And so during her evaluation, those cells were biopsied. They were obtained without her consent and actually shared widely throughout labs, which is a common practice in the 1950s. There wasn't this consent that was given. The special things about her cells was that they grew very fast. They were one of the most well-known immortal cell lines. And so they've been used sort of since then to develop lots of different fantastic treatments, including in cancer research, vaccine trials. But the most important part was that she did not give consent, nor did her family know anything about this until very recently. And so, despite the fact that was done, her family didn't have consent. And so that really highlighted we need to have consent for biological samples. There's other studies that have done the same, but since then, consent needs to be given. And so those are some of the specific examples that people have, they have mistrust in research studies. But it's not only these research studies that people sort of think about when they're thinking about participating themselves. They're thinking about the treatment that's happening now within the medical system, and it's reinforced by sort of the discriminatory care that they're getting today. And so it's not just, it's in the context of that people sort of, that we think that people have when they're considering participating. And we've seen this pretty recently over the past few years with the advent of the COVID vaccine. And so we knew that it really, because of the historical lens that people take and the mistrust that people have with our communities and our academic medical centers, it really took a lot of trust and partnering with communities to sort of develop that vaccine and also disseminate it. So as part of a community engagement trial. It was called the Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities. The communities around the country that were most hardest hit by COVID-19 really partnered with churches and with medical centers to really understand how to get the vaccine to the people who were being historically marginalized by the virus. And so that's sort of the background of why we have to really promote equity and having communities really take part in designing trials and telling us what is needed to sort of make them more equitable. There are other barriers to participation as well that Margie will discuss, Dr. Luisius will discuss.
No, thank you for that, Jessica. And I think the thing to kind of, drive home with what you're saying is that there's definitely been, a lot of, historical egregious activities, because we can't even call it research, right? Because it actually was not even done in the right way. But there's been present day things that have happened that make people concerned about participating. And again, it's the idea of, just everyday, current day racism in society that people are experiencing when they interface with the healthcare system, and makes them question the trustworthiness of their clinicians and their researchers. And I think one study that I think that, did a good job, giving some objective evidence of what people are experiencing in an exam room, and how, how some clinicians are showing up in the exam room and how that can affect the therapeutic alliance. Was one study where they looked at nonverbal communication of physicians that were providing end-of-life care. And you can imagine in end-of-life discussions, is a very tense, discussion about something. And this was actually, but this was a simulated situation. And what the researchers did in this study was that they created like a non-verbal communication score. And what they included in that was like open body language, percent time interacting with patients, how much time the clinician like non-diagnostically touch the patient as well, and then also how much distance they were from that patient. And again, you can imagine with this kind of topic, you would want there to be eye contact and touching and being close to that person. And what they found was that the white physicians in this study actually had statistically significant, very low nonverbal communication scores. So again, this is, what people are experiencing, on a day-to-day basis. And you can imagine then you're turning around and the same person is saying, okay, do you want to participate in my research study? And it's like, look, you can't even look me in the eye, or pay attention to me or make me feel safe in this setting. And then you want me to participate in a study, So I think, again, it's the idea of us, showing up in a different way. And I think the concept of trustworthiness, so this is actually a new reframing of the concept of trust. So again, typically we're thinking, researchers will say, oh, we need to gain the trust of, this population. This population has a lot of mistrust, and again, the reframe is thinking more, how can researchers and institutions and even pharmaceutical companies, how can they appear much more trustworthy, to historically minoritized and marginalized communities? And again, bringing up the example of COVID again, and the vaccine, a lot of, people were perceiving, again, this, rapid turnaround of creation of the vaccine as being very curious. People were saying, okay, clearly, when there's intention and effort and resources, we can make, amazing things happen, and create this amazing vaccine, right? But just a couple of, weeks ago, when I needed some resources, to be helped in my community or to support me with, a treatment for something, no one was there. There were no resources. No one can do anything for me. So again, we have to think about, how are we showing up day to day, and then when it's time to engage people, again, how are we going to be perceived? People are not going to want to, necessarily be enthusiastic about participating because we weren't, being engaging to begin with.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stern and Dr. Luisius. And to add to your points about the importance of community engagement, I also think about engaging the community by investing in the research infrastructure, because that can often be lacking in communities that have a large portion of underrepresented minorities. And then as a next step and layer to that is actually even outside of the built environment, the staffing of the research structure with the coordinators, the patient care coordinators, the study coordinators, and the investigators, or the people conducting the research, making sure that they're diverse as well and a reflection of the community. And that would, help with this multifactorial sort of barriers and challenges that are faced. Just thinking of it in a holistic way. And I know that I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Stern, because I know she has some comments around, whose responsibility is this to ensure that there's racial diversity in clinical trials and studies?
Yeah. A lot of times, especially sort of as the people on this call, we think, well, those researchers who study disparity specifically or equity specifically, those are the people who should, study, who should be responsible for recruiting minoritized patients or historically marginalized people who haven't usually participated. But it's really everyone's responsibility who's doing research to recruit and retain patients, as we said before, to have a more representative sample and to really understand how medications work in everyone, that making sure that it's effective. And it's just a matter of justice and equity. And so every single person who's doing research or who's studying different methods of improving outcomes should be responsible. And that's sort of our duty as scientists and as researchers. And that means making sure that the people who are working on your studies are reflective of the population, really becoming culturally competent, mitigating any bias that you may have, so that we are sort of promoting justice and equity in our trials. So that's an important part that every researcher needs to sort of acknowledge, that it's everyone's responsibility. And so we touched on this a little bit before. Dr. Luisius, can you tell us what are the consequences of not really having diverse participants?
No, thank you for that. So I think number one, again, I want to circle back to the concepts of, when you're doing research, you really want to make sure that you're having the subjects in the research being reflective of the people who actually have the condition. And it's so that when you're trying to find out the effectiveness, for example, of that particular intervention, whether it be a drug or an intervention that's on the environment, for example, you want to be able to know, did I really find the answer or not? Because again, if I'm testing it on the people that are not significantly impacted on this, then when I'm actually getting those those results, and then I'm doing a statistical analysis to assess, is this really, a correct answer or not, then you're not going to really be able to have a lot of confidence in the data. I mean, I think, again, when we are trying to then, say if this is, being confident in the data and saying this is effective or not, and then we're trying to then spread it across and disseminate that particular intervention, typically that's where we're going to end up seeing the impact of the lack of diversity in that sample, and again, what I mentioned before, even clinicians ourselves or even patients themselves, you may see, oh God, that drug, seemed to have done well, or that intervention has seemed to have done well when it was in a smaller, population. But then when it hit the market, somehow it's not, seeming to have enough uptake. And part of that is because of the idea of, needing to have that diversity as part of as part of the research study of in itself. And I think the other idea, which, again, maybe Dr. Wright could even add to, is that really what you want to be able to do is include patients and the patient voice before the study is actually done. I mean, there's actually been, I think in the social sciences or maybe in health services researchers, there's been a bigger push to actually include patients even, in the beginning stages before you even come up with a research question and say, okay, let's go to, patients who are affected by this particular condition and ask, what do you want us to answer here? And then come up with a question and then come up with the design along with them having a co-design, approach. But again, if we're coming to people a little bit later in the planning process, we're not going to be able to, again, plan the study in a way that's effective and also even ultimately end up with an intervention that's going to end up having good uptake in the community.
Yes,
And I just want to interrupt quickly. We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'll be very quick with this response to reiterate Dr. Luisia's point that even in the pre-planning, we want the diverse patient voices, because even like logistical things, the number of study visits, where the study visits are occurring, the frequency of the visits, we need to understand different perspectives and incorporate that so that we can, lay a better foundation for participation among diverse patient groups by incorporating their voice from the onset.
That's right. And then those inclusive practices also sort of increase participants' interests and confidence in new treatments. And as we said, a key goal in increasing diversity in clinical trials is really promoting fairness. And so fairness, part of that is removing, as we said, obstacles to participation and doing things. What are sort of solutions that we can have to sort of these participations? And so some of the things that we can talk about as solutions to increase diversity in clinical trials are really having them less siloed. As we all discussed before, a lot of times they're taking place in big academic hospitals, but really disseminating the resources that we have for that. Dr. Wright talked about having community advisory boards. And really, we have all seen that there's differences between what's going on with trials that predominantly deal with sort of diseases like cancer, and they have a lot of resources in big centers that are big cancer centers, and things like patient navigators and boards and outreach, really moving to that sort of model for different disease states like asthma and food allergy. And I think that Dr. Luisius was going to talk about that a little bit more.
Right. And I think one of the issues is that, for example, the cancer hospitals tend to actually have a community engagement or a COE. And so really there's already an infrastructure in place a lot of times in oncology trials to actually engage the community, because they have a standing community advisory board and they have patient navigators and all these other resources to quickly be able to execute a trial, involving the community voice. But again, in allergy immunology, we do not have a similar or analogous type of infrastructure. So again, we're kind of, a lot of times we're in a situation where if we want to include the community voice, we're starting from scratch to be able to do the work. And I think part of that is why people just don't do it, because they see it as hard, and they see it as difficult, and they say, I don't want to do this extra thing to be able to engage the community because it's going to delay the research. And I think the other thing that as another potential solution is actually encouraging more crossover and pragmatic trials. Because again, what we talked about in the setting of the different phases of clinical trials, there are going to be some where a participant may be randomized to a placebo. And again, if you're someone with a condition that actually wants to get treated, you're going to say, hey, I don't want to be in this trial if I'm going to get placebo. And so I think, again, encouraging researchers to think about how can you design the trial in a way where actually maybe the patient will start off with a placebo, but then they cross over to be able to get that active drug at some point in the study. And again, maybe it'll like lengthen the length of the trial, or you potentially may need resources, but again, you pretend that the payoff is that you'll get more engagement and more participants as well. And then, and I think Dr. Wright, maybe you wanted to talk about a little bit about some FDA mandates and other policy changes, and then maybe we can
yes,
I'll be Q&A.
Really quick to say that, policy change is one way to drive diversity in clinical trials, and the FDA does have a mandate that they recently released to say you have to have an enrollment plan to have diverse populations. And as Dr. Luisius and Dr. Stern mentioned, that plan, the population in the study has to reflect that prevalence of disease, the differences among different racial and ethnic groups. So you have to be more representative of what's actually going on in the disease state from an epidemiological standpoint. And so I think just want to reiterate the importance of everything that we mentioned, but also the policy change, advocating for policy change to help. It's a multifactorial problem, and policy change can help drive the solution as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So this was a great conversation. I think we tried to do the fireside chat virtually as much as possible, but I really hope our audience enjoyed this as well. And then I wanted to just open up the last 5 minutes or so for any questions or comments from the audience.
Yeah, you can all, if anybody has a question, please don't be hesitant. You have the opportunity here with experts who can really share their expertise and experiences, their perspectives on these issues. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat.
I think Thomas Lavera is raising his hand.
I see a hand raised. Yeah.
Yay.
How are you? It's good to see you all on this panel today. Is it okay speaking on here? I don't know if I had to put my question in the chat or I can just.
Oh, I think this is working. This is working. I say go for it.
More efficient.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I know one of the things when it comes to like research trials and clinical trials, I've been seeing on my end, especially when I'm doing research and everything, we talk about the mistrust. And when I also focus and speak with legislators and community leaders, there's not a lot of implementation in terms of getting the access to these marginalized communities. And they're also, the way these communities are reacting, they're looking more for an incentivized type payout opposed to just being part of a clinical trial. Because if you look into these communities, those are the most, underserved communities are more looking for what is it for me, opposed to giving back. And I understand that we all want to do our part to give back, which will better, our health outcome, depending what it is in asthma, immunology, or whatever it may be in. But in these communities, they are suffering. So in order for them to be a part of these trials, they want something that's going to be substantial in terms of incentivizing what they're going to be a part of. And also, we go back to the trust. It's like, how is the information going to be implemented within the research and not exceed beyond that in terms of like allotting that information to other areas?
No, I mean, I think you bring up really great points. I mean, I think the issue of incentivizing is really important. So I think two answers I'm thinking of is, one, this is kind of like where it's a duty, of an academic medical center to actually support the surrounding community. So actually here in Massachusetts, we actually have that where, all the institutions are supposed to be having these community assessments where they're actually, supposed to be, providing different resources into their surrounding community. And I think if hospitals were actually holding up their end of the bargain in the right way, then at least now when we're saying, hey, we're doing our duty, and now we're engaging in resource, then we're engaging in our research, then the communities would feel more supported. So I think that's a clear gap right there that the medical centers are not showing up. I think another issue is, and again, I'm curious about what Dr. Wright and Dr. Stern think here, but one of the issues is that when we have to do an IRB, and when to get the approval for these studies, we have to do something called an informed consent, where we're like telling you the details of the study, but then we also will provide usually like, hey, here's an incentive, here's a gift card, here's money. But the IRB is really, really strict on making sure like the amount of money and the thing that you're giving the participant is not coercive. But what I've noticed is that it's never clear, like how much is coercive? Like, is it at $100 or is it $200? Is it, and then on top of that, a lot of times they don't want you to give cash. You have to, the person has to provide their social security number so that a check can be given. So it's like all these barriers, like the person's coming in and then they don't get the money like a month later, So I think that, this is kind of a situation where the IRB, and whatever, entity is, governing and managing that IRB has to think about, again, how can we show up better to our community and provide an incentive that's technically not coercive, but at the same time is meeting a need that they have.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we need to reevaluate like the sort of price that we're putting on people's time, because we do require a lot of time, but yet sometimes the token, sometimes we call it a token of appreciation, is like it may suggest that the time is undervalued.
Exactly.
And so that needs to be reevaluated when we're thinking about equitable policies, not coercive, but just reevaluated and sort of adjusted, given that we are requiring time from participants.
Yeah, I agree. And this is why a lot of the trials are moving more towards always having community people from the beginning design the trials and talk about, well, what is reasonable? What would be a reasonable sort of compensation? What other sort of incentives can be given? And what would feel the best for someone who's participating and sort of going through those. But as Dr. Luiz and Dr. Wright said, there are these limitations put on the institutional review boards.
Oh, you're muted, Jan.
I'm saying it was a very important issue raised, so clearly this is something that has to be dealt with and some guidance given for you in your work, in being able to recruit, the folks for your studies, right? So thank you for that. Anybody else want to raise their hand? And we'll forget the chat box. We'll just raise hands. Anybody else? Nobody else. Well, we had a great question, and I want to say anything else, any final statements that any of you would like to make, Dr. Louisias, Dr. Wright, Dr. Stern? Any final statement, comment?
I mean, I think we just had like two myths that a lot of times people would say. That comes up a lot of times, and so I think one myth that sometimes people are concerned about is, if you're in a clinical trial, you won't get the same level of care that you would receive typically. And the idea is that, you know, if you're in a clinical trial, the care is actually excellent. And if anything, you're actually being watched more closely when you're in a clinical trial, because there's actually, guidelines that we have to adhere to. And if there's any deviations, then you have to report it to the IRB. So actually is, really important for us to do that. And then I think the other thing is being in a clinical trial doesn't actually help the person that's participating in them. And I think it actually goes back to even Thomas's point about people feel like they want something more than the trial itself, but specifically in the setting of, if you're in the active, treatment arm of that particular study, again, the idea is that, you have the opportunity to receive something that you wouldn't be able to receive otherwise. And so you actually may get better care in that setting as well.
Excellent point. Anybody else? Dr. Wright, Dr. Stern, final words, or are we good?
I'd just like to thank everyone for, listening, and I'm very happy that I was able to participate.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We're getting comments here. Thanks so much. And so I'm going to say thank you so much for this incredibly informative discussion. It could have gone on for hours. And so you packed a tremendous amount of information to highlight the issues, so many issues raised that are so important. So thank you to each of you, Dr. Louisias, Dr. Wright, Dr. Stern, for providing us with this incredibly informative program. And I'm going to close by saying the impact of racism on racial diversity in research and allergies and asthma has significant consequences. We heard some of them this afternoon. If you didn't already know them, hopefully you've been better informed today. And this needs to be recognized. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be appropriately addressed. Social determinants of health play a significant role in preventing health equity. And the inclusion of diverse populations, as we've heard today, in medical clinical studies will lead to proper diagnosis, appropriate care, and follow-up by a medical professional to allow for improved health outcomes for everyone. And so AAFA New England's goal with today's webinar was to hopefully help you have a better understanding of the complexities and implications of this issue. And whether you're a medical provider, a clinical researcher, a public health worker, an educator, a patient, a legislator, a policymaker, we all need to do what we can do in our lanes and our roles, and sometimes reach outside of those roles if we need to move this issue forward so that everyone will have access to healthcare that they should, because health equity should be a given, and it isn't, and we want it to be. So thank you for this. I also want to thank Metro Credit Union again for their sponsorship of this webinar. And before we close tonight, we're going to switch gears just a bit. I'd like to mention a few of the upcoming events that AAFA New England has planned.